Alexander Kuprin is considered to be the second echelon of Russian authors, if we want to categorize them in any meaningful way. The entirety of the 19th century was dominated by these lengthy novels by Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky, with their ponderings on societal problems and deeply philosophical questions. Anton Chekhov broke this mold and brought the short story into the mainstream, because before him, short stories were considered frivolous and a lesser form. Chekhov, however, was writing in the 1880s, 1890s, so it's the authors of the turn of the century who fully embraced the style and focused on the short form. And after Chekhov, Kuprin is probably the most famous of them all. He's written over 100 short stories, some novellas and novels, but even his novels are relatively short. The Wheel of Time, that Kuprin himself labeled as such, is only 80 pages, so he still was leaning into the shorter format. There might be also a meta reason for it. Anecdotally, his first wife was forcing him to write. She wouldn't let him back into the house until he pushed the newly written pages under the door for her to read. He once tried to trick her and give her one of Chekhov's stories, but that didn't work. And the reason for it was that Kuprin was an alcoholic, and that was her way of making him work instead of drinking. So in a sense, we have her to thank for it. Still kind of abusive, though. But still, you will often see that Kuprin ends his stories almost abruptly. He doesn't do lengthy endings. Sometimes it all ends with a single sentence, and the reason for it is that he wanted to finally be done with the story and go out drinking. Famously, that's why the Duel ends the way that it does. Kuprin had this whole chapter planned out in his head of protagonist thoughts that lead to his ending, but instead we have a very curt description of the events that transpired, and one could argue that it all worked out for the best. Today I'm not doing a deep dive into a specific book or the author's biography like I normally do. I want to highlight some trends in Kuprin's writing and maybe talk you through some of his most famous pieces, and maybe you will be then tempted to check out one of them for yourself. I'll try not to go into full spoiler mode, but I will still be talking themes, so it's kind of inevitable, so this is your blanket warning here. Kuprin, by his own admission, believed that authors need to write about the things that they know and have lived through, i.e. stories need to be rooted in reality. Kuprin himself worked many jobs, so that helped him quite a bit, and he was also working for a paper writing editorial pieces, so that also exposed him to the real world. I've heard an opinion that Kuprin's stories are more plot-driven, which might be true if your definition of that is that he doesn't spend 10 pages describing the sky of Austerlitz, but at the same time, my view is that he is much more focused on the emotions and feelings of his characters, even if the events move the plot along. The only story that I've read that was 95% plot was Liquid Sun, that talks about an imagined scientific discovery by an English gentleman, very Jules Verne style. I liked an opinion that Kuprin comes pretty close to sentimental prose. It's just that sentimentalism in Russian literature ended about a century before that. But what is also true is that Kuprin focuses on emotions and events, but doesn't bother with deep philosophical questions much. Lengthy Russian prose has always been obsessed with these deep philosophical ponderings, like Raskolnikov's very flawed philosophy of am I a trembling creature or do I have the right, or Pierre's kind of shifting understanding of reality in War and Peace. Kuprin doesn't go that deep. He still interrogates the nature of man, but he is much more down to earth. It is likely influenced by lack of any true convictions in Kuprin himself. He is often described as a man who was feasting on life, trying to taste everything that it had to offer. That's probably why he had those 20+ jobs, and that's also probably why literature appealed to him, as it's just another avenue for exploration of life. But on a macro level, Kuprin didn't seem to have any true beliefs. His lifetime fell on a very turbulent time for Russia, and yet he still didn't voice any particular ideologies. He didn't speak out against the overthrow of the monarchy in 1917, and he even met Lenin, whom he didn't like very much. But then, during the Civil War, when the White Army came to his home in Gatchina, he ended up living with them and ended up in immigration in Europe. But his immigration wasn't ideological like it was for Bunin or even Nabokov. It just simply happened to him. And Europe, Paris in particular, just offered him another locale for him to explore life, even if his life in emigration was spent in poverty. But my point here is that he didn't display any particular strong political beliefs, he wasn't religious, didn't voice any opinion on human nature, and so you won't find anything like that in his prose either. And arguably that makes him more accessible. If you've seen my episode on Davlatov, he compared himself to Kuprin, and Davlatov probably said it best, that there are writers and there are storytellers. Don't think me insincere, but I'm not sure I consider myself a writer, he explains in an interview. I would like to consider myself a storyteller. It's not the same thing. The writer is busy with serious problems, he writes about what people live for, and the storyteller writes about how people live. And that goes perfectly for Kuprin. He simply tells stories of people from all walks of life, from Princess Vera in the Garnet bracelet to the prostitute Luba in the pit. And arguably that was something new for the Russian literature of that time period. Not long philosophical debates of the nobility, but these slices of life of ordinary people. Chekhov started it, but Chekhov has a very particular sense of humor and sarcasm to his stories. Kuprin does not do that. He's much more level-headed and detached, if you will. What does he talk about then? Most prominent is the theme of love. It's going to be present in the majority of his pieces. Even stories like Moloch and Duel, where arguably the center theme is different, the theme of love is still very much there. You will see some commonalities in how Kuprin portrays love as I talk you through these pieces, because Kuprin seemingly believed in this idea of unconditional selfless love that I find somewhat problematic. Let's start from a different angle when it comes to love, though, and look at two very different stories. Sulamith is Kuprin's retelling of the Old Testament story of King Solomon and his love for young Sulamith. The story touches on the biblical nature of it, as well as the character of Solomon and his proverbial fairness, but it is also this love letter to the female beauty and love. Kuprin does not shy away from the physical nature of it, just as the spiritual and the emotional side. It would have been better had he not chosen the biblical story, because the story of love between a 45-year-old man and a 13-year-old girl is rather difficult for me to read, but as far as I know, it's par for the course for the Bible, so hey-ho. The story is incredibly rich in descriptions. It's vibrant, it's full of colors, smells, tastes, and textures. And despite the fact that it's a creepy mésalliance, and it's not pure, really, but it's not dirty either. There's this reverence in the way that Solomon views Sulamith and the way that she looks at him, so if not for the age difference, it could have been truly beautiful. There's thrill and awe, devotion and adoration in the way that Solomon and Sulamith look at each other, but there is also honor and respect in their love. It's a tragic love story, like most for Kuprin, but it's the bittersweet kind. The love here is described as if it lifts you up. It's a more positive take on it. On the other end of the spectrum, however, exists the pit. The pit is probably the most controversial piece by Kuprin. It was considered to be immoral and reprehensible for the longest time because it is fully dedicated to the life of prostitutes, or sex workers, or whatever the PC term is these days. The story instantly throws you into the cesspit of the life of a low-end brothel with all the various regulars, madams, and prostitutes. There is no glamorizing of this life. It's a miserable existence, the lowest of lives. Each girl is given a different description and character traits, but they're not necessarily good or bad. They're all flawed individuals. Some skew one way or the other, and most make bad or questionable decisions. A notable plot point is a girl called Zhenya who contracts syphilis and in an act of revenge tries to pass it on to as many regulars as she can until she meets a young innocent boy. These women are complex, but there are no easy paths or choices for them, and this makes this book a rather uncomfortable read, but important nevertheless. This is quite an opposite depiction of physical love from Sulamith. But what Kuprin normally leans to is the depiction of unconditional, unconsuming love. In the Dark is a rather disturbing story. A girl meets a man on the train and she falls in love with him after he chases away another man who's been harassing her. She continues dreaming of him as she takes the position of a governess in the household, until the head of the house starts paying attention to her and it almost turns abusive, but he lets her go at the last minute. The guy from the train at the same time loses quite a bit of state-owned money while gambling, and as she runs into him in the street, she fears that he might do something stupid. So she goes back to her abuser and offers herself to him in exchange for money that her beloved needs. Only the guy doesn't even care or appreciate what she's done and doesn't even want to come clean about the deception that he's pulled because it's going to ruin his reputation, and thus she finally sees him for what he is. This is one of the earlier stories for Kuprin. It was accused of being melodramatic, which might be true. You as a reader see the red flags from the get-go, but the girl does not, so it makes for quite a sad read, because Kuprin seemingly doesn't want to give her a way out. This is an example of a story where Kuprin doesn't show his cards fully when it comes to love. He does not provide any moral judgments on the characters' actions, he just simply lets them play out. But this seed of unconditional love starts growing from here, even if it's somewhat framed as unconditional love to an undeserving person. The Garnet bracelet is Kuprin's most famous piece and kind of a staple for when it comes to his love stories. In it, a small civil servant falls in love with a married woman of a higher station. He starts following her around, watches her from afar until she asks him to stop. Later, he sends her an extravagant gift of a garnet bracelet, which prompts her husband and brother to confront him, and that doesn't end well. The traditional reading of the story is that this man had this pure love that comes once in a generation, and she missed out on it. It is framed that this great love doesn't even necessarily need to be reciprocated, as these glances from afar are enough to sustain it, and yet she is the one who didn't appreciate it enough, or she wasn't smart enough or emotionally intelligent enough to notice this great love. He even gets to offer her forgiveness in a roundabout way. It is framed as this selfless love because he's not really asking anything from her, and yet he still doesn't let her be, he's not leaving her alone, and arguably in his final act he forever attaches himself to her. It looks like it might be a true reading as far as Kuprin is concerned, because the similar motifs appear in other stories, notably in the Duel, although it is not fully explored there. I personally do not like this reading or this portrayal of great love. I've done a full episode on the perceived morals as we see them from the 21st century, specifically as it relates to stalking and obsessive love, because I do not think that a man who does not take no for an answer and consistently stalks a woman is this embodiment of true love. But this is a perfect example of what Kuprin views as love. In Olesya, the protagonist Ivan meets a young girl called Olesya who lives with her grandma in the woods, and there are also witches. The villagers hate them quite a bit and blame them for all of their misfortunes. A love story develops between Ivan and Olesya, so when the time comes for him to leave, he asks Olesya to come with him and marry him, but she refuses, not only because she does not want to leave the wild and freedom of the countryside, but also because she cannot go into a church to marry him because she's a witch and thus belongs to the devil. After an altercation with the villagers, Olesya is hurt, and she and her grandma leave these parts for good. The story hits on a few bits beyond the love story itself. Olesya is an archetypical character that we might now be tempted to call a manic pixie dream girl. She's not of this world, she's mysterious, she's unpredictable, she's in her element in the woods but wouldn't realistically fit into the life in the city. Her attempt to fit in when she goes to church almost turns fatal, but the thing is that she as a character is whole. She does not need to do anything to be complete. She knows who she is. The protagonist, on the other hand, does not. He's looking for meaning, and he's looking at her as if she's going to be his solution. But in the same breath, he also doesn't understand who she really is, like he doesn't know himself. So in a sense, the relationship was doomed from the start, not only because they come from these different worlds in star-crossed lovers kind of way, but I'm also tempted to put the blame on him and the weakness of his character. Because again, if we assume that Olesya loved him with this unconditional love, then it was Ivan he was too weak to fully accept it. The interesting thing is that a novel written 30 years later repeats the same motive but goes deeper. The Wheel of Time provides a seemingly more level approach to the romantic relationship. The story encompasses the entirety of a relationship between the protagonist Mikhail and a woman called Maria, from their first meeting to the very end of their dalliance. The story still has these elements of heightened version of love, since the protagonist is first attracted to the mysteriousness of Maria, this woman that embodies mystery and secret. For the longest time, he does not even know her last name, what she does for a living, where she lives. She's this idea of a woman, what femininity is. But once he starts learning more about her and the reality of what she actually is does not fit the image that he's created in his mind, he starts losing interest. He names the embroidered peacock that she's made the first indicator of their future separation, since in his mind, a woman like her cannot earn her keep by doing manual labor, even if it's some intricate and very beautiful embroidery. This is almost like a logical continuation of Kuprin's other pieces. All of these men in love with their Princess Veras and Olesyas, they simply never got to this point of understanding that the woman that they were in love with was likely never real, but simply an image that they've created in their minds, and such discrepancy leads to disappointment. Most of them end the relationship never understanding that, alarmingly most often because somebody dies. There's even an argument to be made that Romashov in the Duel never understood that she's betrayed him, although it's left ambiguous. Ironically, the very first story in the Dark does, but there Zinaida learns who her chosen one truly is, and it almost kills her. This is how I read The Wheel of Time, but I need to say that there is also a reading that says that it was actually Maria who had this unconditional love, and Mikhail was simply too weak to understand it. This checks out if we compare this story to Olesya, where Olesya was the one to have this unconditional love, but for me it's just simply a less interesting reading of the story. The relationship in The Wheel of Time is by no means a healthy dynamic, but I think it provides an interesting glimpse into how some men view women, and it could potentially be even a better cautionary tale than Olesya, since normally the problem does not come from the outside via villagers with pitchforks, but rather from the inside, and is only aggravated by the outside influences. You might have picked up that I have my issues with how Kuprin portrays love, but I want to point out here that no matter how short the format is, it still requires quite a bit of critical thinking from the reader. More often than not, you will see where the author stands on any given subject, but I want to empower you here to question him and his conclusions. And I think it also makes for good literature. Even if you do not necessarily agree with the author and his conclusions, it can provoke a productive conversation. Beyond the theme of love, Kuprin also does criticism of some of the aspects of the life that he's encountered, most notably the failing state of the imperial army in the Duel and the soul-crushing nature of capitalism in Moloch. Kuprin takes rather harsh positions in stories like this, and that often put him against the norm, like it did with The Pit, but in The Pit Kuprin didn't necessarily take any positions. The Duel is heavily inspired by Kuprin's own experience serving in the military, that also fed into some other stories by him. The Duel tells a story of a young man, Second Lieutenant Romashov, in his official capacity in the Russian military and his personal relationships with women. Romashov is framed like he's not like other boys. He's more introspective, he's more sensitive, he often gets lost daydreaming, and that affects his both professional and personal relationships. Like, for example, his daydreaming ruins the marching orders during one of the exercises, and his skewed view of women actually leads to a total disaster. Romashov in his soul-searching is put in front of the backdrop of a Russian army that is completely fallen apart. It is portrayed as corrupt, abusive, and only good for performing marching kind of exercises when high generals arrived to inspect them, and they even managed to screw that up. This theme caused quite an uproar because up to that point the Russian army was only portrayed as this noble and great institution that could do no wrong. Notably, Leo Tolstoy was not happy with this portrayal of the army because he remembered the army from way before, and Kuprin was serving in the 1890s and saw the decay and the collapse of this great institution. Kuprin portrays an army that is incompetent, abusive, cruel, and immoral, that is based on fear, where only simple people can succeed, and people like Ramashov, who are more idealistic and truly believe in the good for the country, they don't stand a chance. They find ways of escapism and self-destruction, like another officer called Nazansky, who drinks to forget. The Duel is where Kuprin probably comes closest to ponder deeply philosophical questions. When Ramashov becomes fully disillusioned with the army, he needs to find a new meaning for his life, new pillars to build his life back on, and he even comes close to identifying them, but he never gets a chance to actually do that, and we don't even know, and we're not sure if it's really realistic for him, so this problem remains unsolved. Ramashov could also be viewed as this requiem to the superfluous man type. He's more introspective, he's more romantic, if you will, than the society around him, but he's also weaker. He cannot stand up to the society around him, and arguably his romantic side is what ultimately leads him to his downfall. Moloch is interesting. It is based on Kuprin's own experience and research he'd done on the iron and sheet rolling factories, and there are also a couple of other stories on the same topic. Moloch tells the story of a man called Andrei Bobrov, who is an engineer at the factory, and his failed love story. Both bloodlines are triggered by the arrival of one of the factory owners, an unpleasant man who is completely repulsed by the factory that he's come to inspect, but he's perfectly happy to profit from, something that annoys Bobrov, who feels compassion for the workers and their poor working conditions. And on a personal level, the girl that Bobrov is in love with starts to pursue the factory owner for his money. The entire story is imbued with this almost anti-capitalist message from the position of workers' rights and the poor working conditions that they're subject to for the profit of people who have no regard for them. The story ends with a revolt at the factory, and there is a poignant scene of Bobrov rushing to the factory while the factory owner flees, and Bobrov starts shoveling coal into one of the dying furnaces in an attempt to blow up the factory altogether, although he does not go through with it. What was pointed out is the truthfulness in the depiction of factory work by Kuprin here. In a sense, it's a time capsule of the problem of the early capitalism of the turn of the century Russia. That was also something new for Russian literature of the time. From the trop's perspective, it's once again the small man type in Russian literature, a small regular person set against the forces that are way greater than him, that's thus set off to destroy his small life. My experience is that on paper it might sound rather dry. The main focus is on the depiction of the life of the factory in its uglier side, but I wasn't bored with it. Kuprin knows how to craft his descriptions to keep the reader engaged, and on top of that, the love story also helps us to relate to the protagonist a little bit more since we view the entire story through his eyes. The image of him wandering the abandoned factory only takes a couple of paragraphs in the text, and yet it sticks out in my mind. I maybe wouldn't recommend this story to a casual reader, but an engaged reader might find something of curiosity here. Another avenue for Kuprin is stories that are geared towards a slightly younger audience, or at least that's how we perceive them now. Stories like The White Poodle or The Elephant fall into this broad category of stories about animals that we now recommend to young school children, and stories like The Pianist and the Wonderful Doctor are Christmas stories. Kuprin had a few stories about animals, like, for example, Emerald, that is entirely told from the point of view of a horse, and these stories are all about the beauty of nature, how powerful and amazing these creatures really are. And disturbingly, I've also seen criticism comparing Emerald to Sulamith, where one is all about the beauty of the horse and the other is all about the beauty of a woman. I had to read that criticism, so let me compare some men to pigs, especially when they write shit like that. The White Poodle is the story of a boy and a dog in a traveling circus, another former workplace for Kuprin. Stories about dogs are almost like a rite of passage for Russian authors, although this one does have a happy-ish ending, unlike some others. I'm looking at you, Momo. Kuprin also has a few more stories set in the circus and a few more about various animals, dogs, elephants, horses and such. The Christmas stories, I talked about them in my video on the subject. These are simple stories about man-made miracles that are often based on real people. Like, for example, The Wonderful Doctor, where a doctor saves a family on Christmas, and it is based on a real-life surgeon called Nikolai Pirogov. What I like about these stories is that magic and miracles they don't come from witches or even God here. It's about people having goodness in their hearts and the ability to help others and thus perform miracles that way. And I think for Christmas stories it's quite a nice message to be that miracle. All these stories have a sense of magic and wonder to them that is quite light-hearted in nature, but Kuprin also explores the darker side of the supernatural, for example, in The Star of Solomon. Early 20th century fiction became fascinated with the devil in his shenanigans, most famously in The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, but Kuprin approaches his devil from a different angle. Here a man unknowingly performs a ritual that binds the devil to him and makes the devil make all of his wishes come true, but he doesn't know it. He goes about his life, but his wishes are so simple and inconsequential that he doesn't even notice that something supernatural is going on. Even in the end, when the devil confronts him and asks him to release him, and in return he would grant him his deepest wish, it's such a small thing that's even silly that the devil tricks him out of it. It's an unusual take on the be careful what you wish for and the trickster devil in general, so it might be a curiosity for you as well. Kuprin has many more stories on a variety of topics. What I've tried to do is talk you through most of Kuprin's lengthy pieces and to highlight some themes in his writing. Hopefully it's given you an idea of what Kuprin and his writings are all about, and maybe you might be tempted to check him out yourself.